Hey there, 1301 students. This is Patrick O'Neill. One thing that I do want to point out from here on out, from chapter 1 through 4, it was mostly thematically talking about the foundations of understanding artwork, how artwork is made, and how people thought about artwork and spoke about artwork. In the next few chapters, we will be talking about certain subjects that are related to art. So in this chapter, we're going to be talking about food and shelter. But each chapter, from now until I believe chapter 12 or 13, we're just going to cover topics. So it's going to be a little bit different, and it may be a little disorienting at first, but just be aware that it feels a bit more jumpier. This is sort of kind of in part because the textbook wants to cover a lot of different material from a lot of different places. There's a tendency, especially for European chauvinism, to show up in artwork. And in this textbook goes to great lengths to include not only different parts of the world and how they react to different topics, but also different parts in time. And so sometimes it can also feel a little bit like a sociology class, or maybe an archaeology class, or a history class. Artwork and human history kind of go hand in hand in telling the story of each other. So there will be a lot of overlap between not just looking at artwork, but sort of understanding the context, which means understanding the history of the time and the place in which the artwork was made. Today, we're going to be talking about Chapter 5, Food and Shelter. In prehistoric cultures, hunters and gatherers would link together the practice of art and ritual to accomplish tasks such as bringing rain or for the promotion for a bountiful harvest. This sort of connection between food and art, when brought together through the practice of a ritual, would be called sympathetic magic. Early mankind was mostly living off of the land. And so early depictions of artwork, especially from cave paintings, would have description of animals in a very interesting sort of way. They'd be turned sideways, and they would have these very large sort of examples of how animals move, what they look like. It'll have information such as animal behavior and where to aim if it was an animal to be hunted, or what to look out for if it was an animal that would hunt us. These Paleolithic hunters and gatherers eventually became Neolithic farmers. The key difference is that instead of sort of finding whatever was out on the land, they would actually alter the landscape to give them food so they can have domesticated livestock. And so these depictions changed a little bit. Gone are sort of the very detailed descriptions of the animals in terms of hunting, but rather it would go into other details such as when is the time to plant, when is the time to harvest, and how to care for your domesticated stock. Most of these depictions tend to be very literal, meaning if you're going to be describing a river, you would draw that river. If you were going to be describing a goat, you would describe that goat. But not all cultures approached it that same way. In Australia, they also have rituals. However, instead of describing the landscape in literal terms, they would use patterns and symbols, sort of as a shorthand. In this painting by Paddy Carroll, you have sort of a modern day sort of continuation of an ancient practice. And in it, these lines and abstract figures aren't just sort of decorative, they mean things. The wavy lines represent certain rivers. The squiggly lines that kind of radiate out from it can also represent the bush. And in it, it's sort of, again, it describes sort of the same kind of knowledge, but is doing it a little bit more of an abstracted sort of way. It's a very interesting observation. There's always that assumption that abstraction art is sort of a new idea. Looking back, we find lots of examples in the past where artists would choose depictions that were abstraction rather than a literal description. Water is essential, and over time people have developed different systems for storing liquids. We could just continue. Well, at first, you had containers, devoid of many description, other than this pure function of being a device to store water. Over time, that kind of changes. In this example here, women at the fountain house, a Greek ceramic vessel, does several different things. Of course, obviously it holds water, but it does so in a very unique way. If you look at the illustrations, they are very beautifully done, they are incredibly ornate. The reason being is that in Greek times, in order to get water from a local urban water well, you would have to somehow prove that you are a resident of that area. And of course, by obtaining pottery to show that you have rights to that water would be quite literally on the side of that vessel. Looking closer, you see two women who are filling up their vessel at the fountain in which this vessel is supposed to be filled up at. This sort of enforces a water rights usage for those in the area. If you did not have a vessel that described that very fountain, you weren't allowed to fill up at that fountain. So it also has a function of not only to contain that water, but also to secure that water source, as well as being an ornate and beautiful object in and of itself. The ancient Chinese would make bronze vessels for storing liquids such as ritual wine. While at first it may seem very different than, say, the Greek vessel, in this example here, it still has sort of the same sort of function for those designs on the outside. What looks like ornate carvings on the outside for just pure aesthetic beauty, these carvings would describe the contents of that liquid. Not only what is it of, but who is allowed to drink from it, and who isn't allowed to drink from it. Other materials can be used for storing water. It may not just be for permanent storage, but maybe for temporary usage as well. These baskets would be woven out of natural materials. These baskets were watertight and also for boiling acorns. They also had sort of a design. Salt, which is an incredibly valuable element, is both essential in terms of food preservation and seasoning, is also a store of wealth. It is used for preserving meat as well as seasoning. Salt wasn't always available to everyone. Having salt is sort of a form of wealth. European nobility used to have these elaborate salt cellars, and they were sort of a status symbol for those who own it. In this example, you have what would be sort of a salt cellar for a Portuguese nobleman, and the origin of it would be in Africa, specifically Sierra Leone. The salt would be contained, as you can see up on the top, whereas the actual material itself is elaborately carved, describing its origin and who it's for, as sort of this very elaborate salt shaker, if you will, as a way to sort of put on display when you have guests over. Of course, in modern times, food is incredibly available, and it is also manufactured to a point of where an essential like salt is extremely common and relatively inexpensive. Also, because of this sort of industrialization of the food source, there is a bit of a disconnect between the product itself and the consumer. Andy Warhol would make these sort of boxes, and these boxes on the side would have the motifs from Heinz 57 tomato ketchup and Del Monte's peaches. They are silkscreen on these sort of wooden sculptures. They look like they are mass-produced cardboard packaging, but really they're not. They're just empty boxes. What the artist is actually trying to do is conjure up the ideas of Heinz and Del Monte's without actually having to show it to you. In the same way that cans can sort of abstract and separate you from the actual product, boxes can do it just the same way. Today, few people hunt their food or grow their own food. We buy our foods in supermarkets. We get them in plastic packages. We are very separated from the actual process of harvesting meat. British artist Sue Coe's "There Is No Escape" is a harsh indictment of the contemporary meat industry. There is a disconnect between production and the consumer. Her goal is to raise awareness of that production back to the consumers. She also creates zines, graffiti stickers, and pamphlets. Art that glorifies food. Food's shapes and textures can be the subject of many sculptures and still life paintings, which can reflect cultural and religious values. In this example, you have sort of a Dutch painting outlaid with sort of a table of desserts. This type of painting expresses several different ideas at the same time. First of all, you have a very lovely spread of food, very colorful and incredibly exotic. But also what you have is sort of an expression of Dutch might and commerce. What you see are all these products that came in and through the shipping industry is sort of exalting this food as being beautiful and delicious, but that it's only possible through the might of the Dutch shipping industry. It sort of suggests at a plentifulness. Nearly every plate is almost overflowing with food. And it also sort of suggests a bountifulness in which people should be sort of thankful for. You see in the background a map of the known world, sort of hinting at the shipping industry. You have a mandolin to the side to sort of suggest a festiveness to it as well. Olives, olive oil, peaches, dates. Incredibly exotic. Coming to the 20th century, our sort of relationship with food is very different. Wayne Thiebaud's painting Pie Counters deals with food as a visual display, as a popular icon, rather than sort of as nutrition for the body. If we look at it, we see sort of a simplified depiction of desserts that you would find at a diner. Each sort of pie is sort of lined up with meticulous care. They all look the exact same, as if they were sort of manufactured. The way that they're arranged also kind of assumes a sort of continuation of these desserts, as if it's coming off of a product line, one after the other, after the other, after the other, with sort of no stop. There's an infinite supply of these foods. That key lime pie is going to go on forever. Same for that pumpkin pie. While also it kind of makes me a little hungry looking at this painting, it also seems to suggest what our relationship is with indulgent food. This is 1963, about 30 or so years after the Great Depression, and also a decade or so past the World War II. Those times were a time of sort of constraining diets, both because of poverty and sort of a limited food supply chain, and for also food rations that people had to endure. Now it is sort of shown as a plentiful bounty of food, albeit manufactured and sort of cheap, and sort of not at all good for you. And so this painting both is describing the idea of plentifulness and maybe the unseen consequences of that kind of surplus. Art can also glorify food as a process. Mukwei's Six Persimmons reflects on Zen Buddhism, which is emphasizing the importance of meditation and simplicity in daily life. This sort of piece is ink on paper. And it's not really so much the painting itself that is the product that the artist is really interested in, but rather the everyday creation of the prosimians. As with any Buddhist meditation, it is not so much the final product, but is the meditative act of the creation. And so through the process of drawing the prosimians, the artist has a chance to actually reflect a sort of appreciation for the daily mundane life. Art about food can also talk about ideas such as religious life, its political reality, as well as agricultural traditions. This silver representation of a maize plant from Peru during the 16th century, not only the maize plant, but also its cultural significance. By making it out of silver, you're sort of creating and elevating a simple plant. Also, its use is not just sort of in description, but as part of a larger tradition of using the maize plant in culture, in food, in clothing, in architectural motifs. And it is so important that it shows up in every aspect of its society. In the 20th century, photographs of food were often vehicles for abstraction and experimentation with the media. It isn't so much a photograph of a plant that is sort of recognizable as food, but rather playing with people's expectations and creating spectacular art from what would be sort of a mundane experience. This sort of reminds me of those prosimians, except at a different approach. Instead of sort of using it as a meditation for the appreciation of the food, it is more or less a vehicle for human creativity, where the artist abstracts it to the point beyond recognition. And so you're focused on the forms, rather than just sort of saying, oh, that's what an artichoke is supposed to look like. In this example, Edward Weston has photographed this artichoke at an extreme close-up. You are sort of given away to the original context of an artichoke. You're only given what you can see. And what you see is very delicate details, beautiful sort of tones between dark and light, lots of texture and lots of detail that you just don't normally see with the naked eye. Edward Weston is a photographer from the early 20th century, and he was really known for sort of pushing the bounds of what's photographed and what could be possible as a subject for art. In this example, this is rather famous pepper number 30. Obviously, it sort of looks like a pepper, right? It's probably one of the more funkier looking type of peppers, but it is still a pepper. But the way he photographed it is very interesting. He's sort of emphasizing the sort of curves of the plant. It gives it almost a sensual human form. The tones also seem to be very lavish and descriptive. Maybe something that would be for a portrait, but is actually given to a common everyday object, such as a pepper. We spend a lot of time in the darkroom and manipulating it so it would come out even stronger with a whole lot more contrast and pop to it. So this interesting comparison can be made between the Parmesians, which can reflect an inner spiritual beauty, while the artichoke is halved, looks at an inner physical beauty. We eat for nourishment, but how we eat is also full of meaning. Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper depicts a meal as a religious ceremony. You have Jesus in the center with his apostles to his left and his right. There's a lot of symbolic meaning in the foods that are being presented. The gestures between the apostles tell the story of each of his followers. The potlatch was a formal mechanism for establishing social order among Native Americans in the northwest coast. Potlatches were not just limited to sort of this example here, where it is a feast dish, where food is given through this dish and is sort of kind of a takeaway after the meal is complete. Potlatches could be anything from tiny figurines to trinkets to sort of baubles and sort of things given to other people as a sign of both gratitude and kind of as a way to serve as a reminder of the meeting and its occasion. In this example, this potlatch seems to be rather kind of small. It can be held within two hands. You can hold a portion of food within sort of that empty void in the middle. Some potlatches can be as large as a table. This is all depending upon the status of the person who's giving away those objects. The bigger the object, the higher in status you are. The smaller you are in status, the smaller the objects can be. But one thing that's really interesting is not only in the size, but in also these sort of visual motifs that are present. Namely, you have these beautiful ovid shapes, semicircle design that seems to reference not only an object such as a fish, right, like a halibut, but also it's done so in a style that is recognizable and connects to an actual tribe. These designs are not just merely flourishes that have sort of an aesthetic beauty to it, but is also encoded with ceremony and religious identity. These sort of shapes are sacred. The Japanese tea ceremony is a ritualized partaking of tea. It is influenced by Zen Buddhism, which is sort of the same philosophy that's behind the 6 persimmons. In Zen, the path to enlightenment can include the most common activities. Interesting thing about this ceremonial teacup is that it's not perfect at all. The paint and finish, the glaze is uneven. The colors sort of have a uneven patina to it. And this is not because they sort of lack the skill to create perfect teacups. And in fact, that's not true at all. Centuries before, there was an emphasis on perfection. Until one emperor drank from a broken teacup and realized that even though this teacup is broken and uneven and maybe quite ugly, it still holds a perfect cup of tea. And so the emphasis became from meditating on things that are perfect, but rather meditating with how things are. And even though it's not perfect, it is still a path in which you can achieve enlightenment. Some artwork can reference a ritual meal, although no food can be shown. The Dinner Party by Judy Chicago is an important icon of the 70s, especially in the feminist art movement. Basically, it is presented as centerpieces on a long table. The dinner party comprises this sort of banquet meal ranged on a triangular table with about 39 place settings. Each of these place settings are commemorating an important woman from history. The setting consists of embroidered runners that have sort of the names and sort of designs that sort of evoke the image of each individual woman. It also has a gold chalice with utensils on the sides. In the center, there is a china-painted porcelain plate with a raised central motif that is sort of based on vaginal and butterfly forms and rendered in styles appropriate to the individual of the woman being honored. This dinner party celebrates traditional female accomplishments such as weaving, china painting, embroidery, and sewing, which have historically been framed as craft or domestic artwork that was basically relegated and de-emphasized because it was driven by women. And so, if you recall from the previous chapter about feminists in art, what they're interested in is elevating sort of those crafts that were once sort of pushed aside in the art world. And she's sort of taking these sort of de-emphasized skills and elevating it to the same level as high art. Most meals are informal, every day. You eat. You're supposed to eat maybe at least 2 or 3 times a day. Not every single meal is going to be a lavish banquet. And through this sort of observation of this mundane can reveal social habits. Drain Hansen, his self-portrait with a model in 1979, is a painted polyester mixed media life-size sculpture of sort of a hyper-realistic scale. And in it, you have sort of a revealing of everyday habits. If you look at the figures on the left and the right, they seem to be sort of dressed in common everyday clothing. Work boots, jeans, and a flannel shirt, and her with sort of an everyday kind of dress. They are sort of sitting in seats that are probably from a diner, the same for a tabletop. Not exactly a fast food place, but then again, not something fancy or glitzy. You can also kind of see the food that they are eating, or maybe that they're not eating. His hand holds an empty Coke bottle. To her, she has barely touched her dessert. In the center, you sort of have these menus laid on the tabletop, but they both seem to be kind of disinterested in its contents. Her handbag has a TV guide and some newspapers, tabloid newspapers kind of hanging out of it. And it sort of kind of is a snapshot of everyday life, kind of brought into this high details point in time in which the viewers themselves can sort of experience it. This is a piece that I actually find really fun and kind of interesting. Janie Atoni transformed the act of eating into an actual artistic process. Remember how sometimes the artwork itself is not the final form that is the interest. It is the process in its creation. Much like the Persimmons, the idea of the artwork is secondary to the process in which it's being made. Janie Antoni's Gnaw, a 3-part installation of chocolate, lard, and lipstick, basically has the artist buy these very massive chunks of material. She would gnaw at it and chew on it, and basically leave teeth and claw marks from her hands and her mouth onto the physical surface of that raw material. What on earth was she really trying to accomplish with this piece? Kind of reminds me of a caged animal. And to keep them from going insane, they would be given little toys to sort of chew on to keep them from going crazy. Janine is sort of also alluding to being as a woman in the 20th century is sort of the same thing, where women are supposed to be kept in a cage of domestic life and are given basically into the indulgence of chocolate, cooking, and makeup to keep her sane. It is seen as sort of an artificial indulgence that can actually keep her from living fully actuated and meaningful life. And now we're going into part 2 of this chapter. First was about food, and now we're talking about shelter. These are sort of the 2 necessary elements for human civilization. Acquiring food and having a place to sort of rest your head at night so you don't get eaten by maybe a leopard. Shelters throughout human history have different styles and done in sort of different ways. We can think about it as a way of creating a shelter for several different needs and several different desires. First off is the need for protection. To protect us from the weather and to protect us from animals or invaders, or maybe even bugs. They are a historical necessity. And also sort of maybe a necessity depending on the region of the planet you find yourself in. If you live on an island, your structure is going to look very different than if you were sort of a nomadic culture living in the icy tundra of the north. They tend to be made out of materials that are available. There's also aesthetic choices. more so than just sort of the practicality of its design, there's also sort of individual and cultural flourishes that tend to be added onto the design of architecture that is sort of becomes a tradition, which is to say it has a need to follow precedent. Why always constantly reinvent the wheel or reinvent your house after generation? It's best to sort of follow best practices from the collective knowledge of the society in which you live in. Sometimes there's also a desire to imitate a foreign style. You start to see this when travel starts to open up. The world becomes less and less isolated, and so there's a greater understanding, or at least an awareness, of different styles around the world. And so some people wish to sort of imitate foreign styles to sort of kind of make themselves feel fancy or world-wise, right? Sometimes these shelters can have a symbolic importance. And also, it can also express the owner's beliefs or aspirations for them or for their society or for their family. Some of the earliest civilizations used group living as a model for their architecture. In this example from Moshe Safadi, created what is called the Habitat. It was designed for the World Expo in 1967, which was hosted in Montreal, Canada. The artist was drawing on inspirations from early living in early civilizations. Quarters themselves are kind of almost haphazardly put together. It is sort of decentralized, and in order to sort of navigate yourself through the area, you kind of have to know your neighbors. The building was also influenced by Pueblo Bonito at Chaco Canyon. The Anasazi tribe would build these houses and structures that would be made out of clay and would have very tight-knit housing, kind of like an early idea of what an apartment complex would look like. Along with nature, it'd be sort of aligned with areas of where resources could be easily found, such as water, pushed up against cliff sides for sort of protection, and areas for grazing for the animals, and also just sort of a comfortable situation for weather. Early examples of group living can also and so you have a new structure that is designed upon the principles that made early group living successful. Group living occurs in villages of the Dogon people in Mali, Africa. Dogon villages are dense collections of adobe houses, shrines, and granaries that are often irregular in shape and are built on different levels to use all available spaces. This is relatively important because when you have a lot of people living within a high density population, you can start to pool resources together. Instead of having shepherds for every single flock, you can combine your livestock into one area, and you can start to have specialization of labor. You'll have someone working at the granary to produce grain for everybody. You'll have people making things for the entirety of the tribe. So everybody can sort of begin the idea of specialization of labor. Individual homes are designed for individual families. They are built basically for the same concerns that group living has, but it's rather more individualized for the habitants of the place. The designs of the individual homes can embody climate concerns. It can also have sort of an expression of your aesthetic preferences, as well as cultural choices. In this example, we have the house of Julius Polybius in Pompeii. This house was preserved with the sort of eruption of Pompeii, covering the entire house in ash, only to be discovered centuries later. And so we can kind of look at this well-preserved house and kind of get a really good idea of what these early houses looked like. Now, the houses themselves were not common for everybody. They were very spacious. They were adorned with lavish artwork and crafts and architectural features that was really only available for wealthy Romans. This wouldn't be, say, something for the common worker, but rather relegated to sort of maybe a senator or a general who has retired. These spaces were well considered. You would have a living area, you would have a sleeping quarters, you could have sort of an area for a garden. And this progression of expression through individual houses even continues to this day, where custom homes and custom houses can get you any kind of house you would like, in any sort of motif or style. It could be a castle, it could be a ranch, it could be whatever you want it to be for those who can. Not unlike Andrea Palladio, he was a chief architect in the Venetian Republic, way back in the 16th century. He was known for creating architectural houses that were houses that weren't based on sort of local tradition, but for reviving older traditional architectural themes that haven't been seen for over 1,000 years. This harmonious shape of his Villa Rotunda in Italy is sort of a revival of classic architecture. Notice it has the columns, it has the Villa Rotunda represent the renaissance of philosophical principles of orderliness and hierarchy. Several different features that were common amongst Roman architecture, such as the rotunda, the dome in the center, porticos with columns along the front and the sides of the building. And there's also a sense of orderliness and sort of the Pythagorean philosophy behind geometry and aesthetics. In other parts of the world, such as in China, during, the first century, in China, the houses were mostly made for the wealthy. They were sort of molded after the palaces of the first emperor. These houses were made of natural materials, such as wood. Because of this, the original houses have not survived. We have a very good idea of what these houses were sort of like. One interesting thing to note is sort of the vertical size of these houses. The footprint itself is relatively small. The majority of the house is actually elevated on one floor on top of another on top of another. The exterior was incredibly adorned with details and ornamentation, not only just in paint, but with lavish sort of murals and designs that sort of recall the family's history and also sort of prominently displaying their status for all to see. Another thing that's really interesting architecturally is that as you move up from one floor to the next, it becomes more and more private. Sometimes houses can be also constructed with a different type of philosophy attached to it, whereas most of the examples we've looked at so far, it's really so much just a standard layout of a house that has several different chambers and kind of is arranged based on sort of aesthetic considerations. Indonesian houses, called toba bataks, are designed to sort of meet the needs of their unique environmental challenges. They live in a very tropical climate. They have a high amount of heavy rainfall. They are surrounded by thick and heavy vegetation. They have to deal with heat and insects. And so their houses are sort of designed to build those type of needs. The stilts themselves kind of raise the entire living quarters up off the ground. This keeps the insects away, and also by raising it up a little bit higher, you can also introduce breeze into the household. That way the air doesn't become stagnant. The verticality of the roof is designed to deal with heavy rainfalls. Under heavy rain, the water doesn't pool on the roof, but it sheets off fairly quickly. But what's more interesting about Toba-Batas is that these houses have a different philosophy behind it. The house itself is sort of personified by a body. Its stilts are kind of seen as its legs. The roof is sort of where the head is. The trap door that's kind of in the bottom, which you sort of use to climb up and into the house, is kind of seen as a navel. You can also further see that kind of personification of this building just by kind of looking at the front, where you can almost kind of see the two openings as sort of eyes. But these traditional houses are built specifically through tradition, and through this tradition it develops into a unique house design that is designed specifically for its unique tropical environment. Again, it's not just sort of aesthetics and what it looks like, it also serves a functional need. Housing can also be shaped by historical necessities. Teepees originally were portable housing for Native Americans of the Great Plains. They were originally for individual usage by a hunter, who would leave an established area to go hunting, and would use it sort of as a place to sort of temporarily put up a place for the evening. It only had room for maybe 1 or 2 hunters, and was easily taken up and taken down, and it really relied on its sort of portability. As the Europeans sort of forced them originally from their homelands and out further west, these teepees had to change. Instead of being focused for only one person, it now had to hold a whole family. Instead of being super portable, it had to be a lot more rugged and a lot heavier. Teepees that were once a temporary house kind of became more permanent. Instead of being moved on a day-to-day basis, they'd be moved sort of on a seasonal basis. So it was made a little bit larger, it was made a little bit stronger, it was made a little bit heavier. So these designs aren't static. Again, people will change their housing as the environment and their situations change over time. Moving to a more contemporary look at architecture and working with the environment, you have Frank Lloyd Wright. Frank Lloyd Wright was an influential architect from the 20th century. And he believed that houses should be unified wholes that would merge into their natural settings using local materials. His spaces would be very large, would do its best to sort of avoid hallways and large partitions of the household. It would have what would be called open floor plans, where one room would sort of merge into the other. The windows would encapsulate the entire walls, letting in a lot of natural sunlight. And he would pull materials from the natural land. Frank Lloyd Wright's most famous architectural achievement, Falling Waters, is one of the most famous modern houses in the United States. The rocks and the stones and materials were all pulled from a quarry that was nearby. And instead of sort of bulldozing the area over to make space for the house was built on the space on top. Its most notable feature is a waterfall that flows right through and underneath the household. To him, this is sort of the perfect symbiosis between architecture and the nature that it surrounds. Moving on, we're also going to take a look at commercial architecture. This is architecture that provides a shelter for the needs of businesses and trade. The Markets of Trajan was a multi-story complex that held administrative offices and over 150 shops from several different vendors. This design kept basically the weather out from their sort of merchant goods. This multi-storied complex also allowed for a lot of different vendors and a lot of different merchants into a compact area, which made commerce much easier. You could go in and you can get everything you need to either maybe supply your farm or supply construction projects, or anything else that you would need in one spot, in one area. The coverings kept the weather out from you. The stone flooring made it easier to carry heavy things to and from. It's so successful, parts of the market are still in use today. This design was incredibly influential. It likely influenced the souks of the Middle East, and also we can easily draw comparisons between these markets and today's shopping malls, with open areas and small doorways, pathways that lead into individual stalls. Most of modern architecture is based around the idea of the high-rise. These tall buildings were not practical until the invention of a safety elevator, which basically kept an elevator from plummeting to its death if there was a mechanical failure. Today's stores and businesses are often located in high-rise buildings. One of the first innovative buildings in the 20th century was the Carson Pirie Scott & Company building that is found in Chicago. This is a building that has roughly about 11 stories. In the past, you would have to sort of climb stairs to go from one floor to the next. But with the invention of the safety elevator, it made traveling to and from made it into sort of a trivial experience. And when buildings can grow up as big as they can without being limited by foot power, this sort of made way for the high-rises and skyscrapers that were so sort of emblematic of the 20th century. So by the mid-20th century, these buildings started to sort of flourish throughout the world. After World War II, Europe needed to rebuild, and they needed to rebuild quickly, efficiently, and as cheap as possible. In this mode, buildings were sort of maximized for space rather than aesthetics. These designs followed very large rectangular buildings. They rose up into the sky, and on the bottom floor would either be typically filled with plazas for people to move in and out, to make entering and exiting the building much easier than, say, the narrow entryways of buildings past. This design was incredibly popular, it was incredibly cheap, and it was fairly quick to build. Therefore, it became incredibly popular. Its influence went beyond Europe and went throughout the entire globe. Any city claiming to be sort of metropolitan, modern, and up-and-coming all sort of created projects that reflected this sort of sensibility and what a urban center should look like. Because of its sort of prevalence throughout the world, and because they all kind of showed up within several decades, this architectural style of skyscraper is called the international style, just because it was seen everywhere throughout the globe. This is sort of the first style of architecture that goes global. This is not only just because it was cheap and easy to make, but also because transportation, world communications through radio and television, and other sort of ways of where companies are becoming larger multinational companies, the influence of the world is starting to sort of spill over into all corners of the globe. And so a lot of people were thinking about architecture in different sort of ways. If you could make architecture that wasn't just limited to maybe one environment or one tradition, and if you had a clean slate on what architecture could possibly be, using these new materials such as reinforced steel and high strength materials, what would they look like? Again, if you go back to the World Expo in Montreal, Canada, there are other examples of this forward-looking thought into what architecture could be in a possible future. Buckminster Fuller was such an architect. He believed that technology could provide more affordable shelter. And he was mostly well known for the idea of the geodesic dome. For him, the idea of not only creating a building would change how people would either live together and also how they would live in relationship to work was not just limited to single buildings or even large complexes. He was interested in creating entire communities as an architectural exercise. His idea for the geodesic dome could encapsulate entire communities in which the temperature on the inside could be controlled. So instead of making architecture that protects you from the elements, this dome would protect you from the elements, leaving up a lot of more freedom, architecturally speaking, to create something better for the inhabitants. His ideas were very forward-thinking and very grand and sort of optimistic view of the future. It sort of became the model for science fiction fantasies and any sort of sci-fi movie that would sort of think about cities that were planned in its entirety. His geodesic dome became a symbol for the 20th century in ideas of its optimism for innovation and human progress. Although never fully actualized, his ideas, architecturally speaking, they do find practical applications, but just not at the scale that he would have wished for. And the international style sort of becomes architectural language for the 20th century. It's not without its sort of detractors. And the international style was sort of seen as sterile and oppressive. It would sort of obliterate any sort of uniqueness of a skyline from one city to be replaced by these sort of soulless rectangles that could almost be sort of mistaken for any other urban city around the world. It was seen as sterile and oppressive, and there was eventually a resistance to that international style. And so, in the closing decades of the 20th century, you started to see more and more architecturalists being a little bit more focused on sort of pushing the boundaries and imagination of what's possible, and also creating structures that not only are innovative in its design, but also reflect the culture or the values of the city in which it lives in. And you'll see this in sort of these newer buildings that were built in the 1980s to the 1990s and on to today, where it's less about making boxes, more about making these architectural expressions that kind of make that one city a lot more unique. Think of Dallas and Fountain Place. It is a very angular building. It's very striking, and currently is undergoing a renovation for sort of expanding it. But it was built in the 1980s. It was sort of a big change, and there were other sort of different architectural thoughts and theories at this time. We have sort of brutalism that comes from Eastern Europe, but over in America and in Western Europe, you sort of have a different kind of reaction against the international style. And this is what we call sort of the postmodern architecture. Whereas postmodernism was a reaction against modernism in art, postmodernism is sort of a reaction against this sort of international style, which seemed to kind of overcome uniqueness. In this example, you have the Plaza Italia, which is sort of a shopping mall in New Orleans. It was built in the 1970s, and it was sort of a reaction against this sort of international style where everything was sort of very same, right? In this plaza, it sort of emphasizes visual complexity. It's sort of an individual building that is filled with color and lots of playfulness in its architectural features. Not only is it sort of playful, it kind of melds ideas of several different genres of architecture and sort of recontextualizes it into a shopping center. Whereas it sort of takes the original idea of, say, the Markets of Trajan, right? The same sort of idea of a shopping center with archways and large open paths. It includes newer features such as neon, bright lights, glitz, and glamour that's more suited to the 20th century entertainment sites and its sort of This sort of idea of postmodernism in architecture sort of speaks to the idea of what's just beyond a building and its shape. It more or less kind of being a lot more playful in its approach and sort of treating it itself as an object of art. Frank Gehry, a contemporary architect whose work kind of started to become prominent in the 1990s, is famous for his structures that seem to be made out of pieces of paper and sort of precariously designed. They look otherworldly. It's like a spaceship sitting next to a Model T. His structures, especially for the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao in Spain, has changed the way people think about museums, and it continues to challenge assumptions about the connections between art, the architecture, and the idea of collecting art and putting it on display. The building itself is sort of initially constructed in tradition by Frank Gehry on a sheet of paper. He just sort of sketches ideas. And he starts with an idea of maybe a curve or a line. From there, he kind of expands on that idea by sort of constructing shapes out of paper. Computer-aided software that makes sort of an idea of a shape and turn it into an architecturally sound model is very helpful in creating these very strange shapes, yet at the same time are very architecturally sound from sort of collapsing in on itself. His buildings are so wild and sort of out there that he wants you to sort of consider these buildings as a sculpture. Just as much as when you go inside this art gallery, you have artwork on the inside, there's also artwork on the outside. Also, it also tells you a little bit about what we can find inside these art galleries. Very different from, say, the design of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it's very solid, very traditional. It kind of tells you about the approach of that gallery. Whereas the Guggenheim, especially with its forward-looking tradition of architecture, gives you a sense that what may be inside is going to be fantastic, challenging, and most of all, possibly disrupting.